Hi, everyone. Welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction, a virtual panel featuring historical novelists with new and upcoming titles. My name is Colin Mustful. I'll be the moderator today. I'm the founder and editor of History Through Fiction, and I'm so glad that you could join us for this special panel. And I'm really excited about these panelists who I'll be introducing here in a minute. Before I do, I just want to go over some of the features here on Crowdcast. So there is a live chat that's in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Let us know where you're joining us from. Anything else that you want to say, maybe some books that you're currently reading. And you can interact there throughout the event. If you want to ask a question of any of the panelists, there's a feature on the bottom of the screen. It's called Ask a Question. So just click on that and you can type your question in there. If you don't have a question, you can actually look through those questions and vote. You can upvote for the ones that you are interested in. So if you see one that's really fascinating, just vote for that. And those with the most votes will kind of rise to the top. So anytime you think of a question, just click on that button and then we'll get to that towards the end of the event. You'll also see a call to action button. It's the green button at the bottom of the screen. Get your book now. So click on that button if you want to find a link to a landing page that has all of our authors' books where you can order and pre-order those books. So I think that takes care of those details. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists. First off here, we have Lydia Kang, the author of The Half-Life of Ruby Fielding. Lydia, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thank you guys for coming. So yes, I am the author of The Half-Life of Ruby Fielding, which is coming out on May 1st. I am also a physician. I work at the Nebraska Medical Center in internal medicine. And I also write young adult fiction as well as adult nonfiction. I just had another book. This one's Patient Zero that just came out this past fall. And it is about the history of pandemics and the science behind them. The sort of subtitle is A Curious History of the World's Worst Diseases. So I have a lot of interest in history, both from a medical perspective and also in fiction. So that's me.
And do you have an excerpt you can read for us, Lydia?
Absolutely. So in the book, just a little setup, there are two characters, a brother and sister, and they discover the title character, Ruby Fielding, sort of unconscious in their home. And they think they need to let her sort of get out of the house as soon as she recovers, but she manages to sort of wheedle her way and stay. So this is a brief perspective from her. Ruby leaned against the doorframe and closed her eyes while she listened to Will and Maggie in the kitchen. She couldn't hear everything, but she heard enough to know they were far from trusting her. Eventually, her legs began to shake and she sank gratefully onto the bed. She still felt odd. The medicine that Maggie had given her had left tendrils of effect in her veins and her head swam. Or perhaps it was giddiness that was making her head swim. How lucky that they had taken her in. Perfect. It was exactly what she needed, without knowing they were such a necessity. Maggie, with those pretty green eyes, so open-hearted and eager to help. She had the loveliest thin pink lips Ruby had ever seen, with two little peaks in the middle. Anyone looking at her would see a mousy, brown-haired girl hiding in the shadows, but she simmered with intention. And she was working at the Navy Yard, a good girl, trying to do good things. Ruby had the feeling that if she asked for the world, Maggie would search for a platter large enough to serve it on. And there was Will. He was so unlike Felix. Quiet, with a massive intelligence in those eyes, all housed in the body of Ares. Ruby had the feeling that he was used to having everything in his life orderly and under control, and Ruby was neither of those things. Will was a pot to stir, and she was looking forward to the ways in which she might wield the spoon.
Thank you, Lydia. That's just such a great description of your characters. It's an excellent excerpt to choose.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to hearing the other ones too.
Well, next we have Elena Gorokhova. She's the author of A Train to Moscow. Elena, could you introduce yourself and read an excerpt for us?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. My name is Elena Gorokhova. I was born and raised in Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, back to its original name. I graduated there. I graduated from the University of Leningrad, from the English department. And when I was 24, I moved to this country alone, carrying a suitcase with 20 kilograms of what used to be my life. And since then, in this country, I've taught Russian, linguistics, and English as a second language. And I've also written 3 books, 2 memoirs, and this first novel, A Train to Moscow. And I would like to read an excerpt from this book, but just to introduce it a little bit, it is about a girl from a small town in the provinces in Russia who becomes an actress and who goes to Moscow to a drama school, and then she acts at a repertory theater in Leningrad. And this excerpt that I will read takes place when she's still young. She's about 7 years old, and her mother takes her from this provincial town to Moscow to see a May Day parade. And that's May 1st, which is International Workers' Day. It's a huge holiday in Russia still. It was and still is. So this is set in Red Square, Moscow, 1950, when Stalin was still alive. Everyone starts walking. People with banners and portraits and red carnations made from construction paper swaying on wire stems. Her mother hoists her up onto her shoulders. So now Sasha is above the people's heads, in the midst of a forest of swaying sticks with flags, banners, and portraits. She peers to her left, where everyone else is peering. There, 5 columns of people away, a group of men stands on a granite platform against the Kremlin wall. In the center is a separate dark figure in what looks like a military uniform. She knows it is Stalin, their conscience and their revolutionary glory, as the radio reminds them every morning. He is the father to all of them, marching in this square and gathered around radios from here to Kamchatka. Only he is so far away she can barely see him. He looks tiny and ant-like, and there is nothing glorious about him. Riding on her mother's shoulders, Sasha tries to lean forward to see him better through the forest of portraits and flags, but all she feels is disappointment. He looks nothing like the father they all know, grand and loving and immortalized in oil. Then the ant raises his hand and the square explodes. Every mouth in every lane of every column splits open in one unified roar, and the forest of banners and portraits jolts and sways as if struck by a blast of wind. It is so terrifying that Sasha screams. But the May Day demonstrators are all safely below, and she is the only one trapped in the center of the storm. The poles of the slogan on her left are rattling by her ear. The sticks with portraits aim at her head from the right. Flags shake with crimson furor and hiss like flames, as if someone has plucked her by the skin of her neck and is about to toss her into the gut of a wood-burning stove. The roar peals over the square like thunder, the mouths fusing into one howling throat, one hungry set of jaws with rows of sticks for teeth, ready to crunch and chew and spit her out.
Wow, I love those metaphors, and you have such a fascinating background, which I'll want to ask you more about a little bit later. Well, next we have Andrea Yaryura Clark, and she's the author of On a Night of a Thousand Stars. So, Andrea, if you could introduce yourself and read an excerpt for us.
Okay, thank you so much for having me on tonight with these wonderful authors. My name is Andrea. I am the daughter of a Canadian mother and Argentine father, and I've had the pleasure of growing up in all 3 countries, but I spent a good part of my childhood in Buenos Aires. As a grown-up, I worked in music and in television. And this is my first novel. So here's, everyone's been showing the cover, so here it is. I'll set it up a little bit. I have a dual narrative in this novel, but I'm going to read from the one that takes place. It reads like contemporary fiction, but it takes place in 1998, and it's told by Paloma. This is Paloma's story. She's a young college student, the daughter of Argentinians growing up in New York. And we find ourselves in a party at the family's weekend house, where an unexpected guest shows up who knows Paloma's father, Santiago, from his university days in Buenos Aires. And her name is Grace. "I see that life has been kind to you," Grace said to my father. "It's true, I've been blessed. Dad put a protective arm around Mom. Not so for some others we knew. Those were complicated times, Grace. Anyway, now's not the time for boring old stories." "Boring?" Grace turned to me. "Paloma, I wonder how much you know about Argentina during those years." I glanced at my parents. Talk of Argentina's military dictatorship in the 1970s had been taboo in our family for as long as I could remember. "Sadly, not much," I told Grace. "Well, I think you should be aware that thanks to your father, many people were spared." I said, "Not now, Grace." My father's sharp tones startled her into silence. He opened his mouth to say something else, but then closed it again. Grace looked at him with a pained expression before turning on her heel and walking off. "I didn't mean to upset her," Dad mumbled without quite looking at anyone. "She has a good memory, but that really was a long time ago." He turned to Eric. "I'm sorry if I was abrupt." "Oh, not at all. I should be the one to apologize for her," Eric said. "Sometimes she likes to talk about the old days in Argentina, especially if she's had a drink or two. She's been an expat for years now, so I think she was excited to see an old friend from university. I'm sure you understand." "Of course, no need to apologize, please." As soon as Eric left, Mom turned to Dad. "She still has eyes for you, that's clear enough," my mother said. She was long accustomed, if not resigned, to the effect her husband had on women. I hadn't given much thought to my father's life as a bachelor, but Grace's remarks made me wonder, what had he been like as a young man? "Grace is stuck in the past," Dad said. "It happened to some people. They haven't been able to move on. I did, that's all." "But she said people's lives were spared because of you," I said. What did she mean by that? It was not often that I was on the receiving end of one of my father's withering looks. A look he'd bestow on a housekeeper when a shirt had not been pressed properly, or when the coffee was not prepared to his liking. But when he spoke next, his tone was gentle. "Ancient history, sweetheart," he said.
Thank you. And I think it shows some really interesting family dynamics there, and really brings us into the story. And I want to know, well, what is this secret? So thank you. Well, I have a lot of questions for all of you. As I mentioned, as we were getting ready, you have some really relevant topics. But before I get into maybe some of your backgrounds and some of the history and how it relates to today, I do like to start with character, because character is what drives fiction. So Lydia, let's start with you. You already read us a description of some of your characters. Tell us a little bit more about William and Maggie Scripps, who they are. And I'm also curious about if they're based on real people or not. And tell us a little bit more about Ruby as well.
Sure. So William and Maggie Scripps are a brother and sister duo. They're living in Gravesend in Brooklyn. And I got the idea from them. Actually, it really all came from Will. So a lot of the genesis of this book came from the fact that a lot of the Manhattan Project and creation of the atom bomb centered around many different places in Manhattan. And one of those places was actually at my alma mater at Columbia, in the physics building, was one of the places where they built one of the first nuclear piles. And I had remembered this when I was in college, but I'd sort of kept it with me that, like, I had heard that they enlisted the Columbia football players to pack these graphite blocks to make a nuclear pile that was in Hupin Hall, or at least, or Schermerhorn, but one of the two sort of science buildings there. And I just had this immediate visceral reaction where I just saw this character as one of the football players who was working in and around the very early beginnings of the Manhattan Project, and probably was a lot smarter than he looked, because again, he's a big, bulky football player. And I thought, how could I make a story around somebody who was so close to this monumental task, this incredibly history-changing, just across the globe, event, who's just a guy trying to get through school and maybe can't get through school for whatever reason. And that's sort of where Maggie comes in. So she's a very shy, really delicate person, physically and also emotionally. So he quits school to sort of help take care of her, comes back to Brooklyn. He's no longer at Columbia. Now he's taking night classes. And I thought, what could we do to disrupt their life really badly? And I thought, we throw a woman into their midst, one that they're both very much attracted to, one that they're both, sort of have some romantic inclinations for, but then you don't really know what her history is. You don't know why she's there. And if anything, that everybody, one thing that everybody knows about World War II, which is when this book takes place in, is that, if somebody's keeping secrets, the first thing you think of is they're a spy. And so Ruby's, I'm not going to give too much away because she's a really, really interesting character. She has a lot of different facets, and a lot of it is keeping her cards close to her chest very early on, while, trying to insinuate into the lives of Maggie and Will.
Yeah, I read that in your forward, or you talked about how you got interested in this and thinking about that college student. So yeah, that is pretty fascinating to think that they just kind of took people off the street and were like, hey, we need help with this, and a good way to kind of get yourself into the story. Well, Elena, let's move on to your main character, Sasha. There's also an interesting story behind her, and how tell us about the inspiration for that character.
Well, Sasha is the protagonist of this novel who becomes an actress. She defies her family. She lives in a small provincial town. Her mother is a doctor. Her grandfather is an engineer, so they expect her to be either a doctor or an engineer. And she defies her family and goes, she wants to be an actress. She auditions for the best school in the country in Moscow, gets accepted, and becomes an actress, a prominent actress in Leningrad, at a repertory theater in Leningrad. And this is the story of my sister, my older sister, who is 13 years older than I was back then, still is. She's still alive. So I grew up with this sister in Leningrad. And she was an actress. She was a prominent actress at one of the best theaters in Leningrad. Of course, I was terribly envious of what she was. I spent all my time that I had free in the wings backstage of her theater, trying to pretend that I can also become an actress. But of course, I was terribly envious. Of course, I couldn't. I knew even then that I couldn't. But all that sort of information, all that knowledge about the theater and how to become someone else and how to be an actor, that process was fascinating then, and it still fascinates me today. So to an extent, this book, I wanted to examine for myself what it takes to become someone else on stage. But the character, her story, her getting out of this provincial town and becoming an actress, that is based on my sister. And my sister was instrumental in sort of helping me write this. She gave me the details that I didn't have of growing up in a provincial town, because I grew up in Leningrad, in a big city. And she was able, she's an artist, so she was able to feel, all those dusty roads, smell the dust, and feel the sense, just have the sense of that place where she grew up. So that is based on her entirely. The mother in the novel is based on my mother. Sasha's mother is pretty severe. My mother was not as severe, but she was certainly a very controlling mother. All Russian mothers are controlling, including mine. So that was, and my grandparents were very similar to what I remember my grandparents. The way they were, the grandparents in the book are very similar to my own grandparents. So it is, you can say, sort of family history as inspiration. And they became, the characters sort of became the microcosm of this Soviet life, almost the Soviet family, this model Soviet family.
Well, just I can see how you were able to bring her to life in that excerpt you read. The perspective of a child, you did so well, and it's really fascinating that you said you tried to be an actor, it didn't work for you, but you drew this connection to bringing something to life, making people feel a certain way, see a certain thing. Your sister did it through acting. You were able to do it through writing. So I think that's really cool.
Yes, well, that's very insightful. Thank you for saying that, Colin. I still, it's still a mystery to me how actors do what they do. I even signed up. I took classes at HB Studio in Manhattan, in New York, acting studio, just to understand what it feels like. And of course, I never made it past level 2. I'm surprised I made it to level 2. But it was fascinating to just watch how people work and how real actors. I also audited, more advanced workshops, acting workshops. And it is a fascinating process, but you're absolutely right. Sort of what we do in writing, I think we inhabit people, we become other people on the page, and actors do it on the stage.
Yeah, and I think you found your calling eventually, so it's okay. So Andrea, I want to ask you about your main character, Paloma. You already talked about her a little bit. Without giving away too much of the plot, can you tell us what does she discover? And I'm also curious, just something that Elena brought up. You having grown up in Argentina as a child, do you see some of yourself in Paloma?
So yes, Paloma is the main character of the story that takes place in 1998, and then her father is the main character of the story that takes place in the early 1970s, in the years leading up to the Argentinian dictatorship. Like Paloma, Paloma grows up in New York, so that I spent the later part of my teen years in New York. But that's about where the similarities end. I did return to Argentina after I graduated from college to work. And like my character, Paloma, I met some sons and daughters of people who had been persecuted during the dictatorship. So I guess that's another point we have in common, but that's about it. And she's going to travel to Argentina when her father is nominated to be the ambassador to the UN. So she accompanies her parents, and while she's there, she's going to do a little bit of an investigation of her own, and because she's curious by what the woman who we meet in the excerpt that I read says about her father, and so she starts doing a little bit of an investigation, and she'll discover a secret history. I don't want to say much else, but yes, it's a mystery.
Well, I wonder if you could keep going with that a little bit, because reading your author's note, you talk about doing your own research about this long before it ever became the idea for a novel. So what is it about? What are you trying to teach the reader, and why have you been on this path for so long?
Right. So when I moved back in the 1990s, it had been just a few years after the dictatorship had collapsed in 1983. And I found that people were not talking about it, even my own family. My father never talked to us, his children, about the dictatorship. We had left just before the coup. I later learned that it was good timing for my family to leave, because he might have been disappeared. It was a really terrible time in the country. But so being there in the 1990s, nobody was talking about it. But then there was a story that came out from about denial of these clandestine detention centers made by a former general. And around the same time, I met somebody who told me that his father had been killed. And it was the first time I'd met somebody who spoke about that time and about how his family had been affected. That just led me to want to learn more. And I met a group of sons and daughters who were just beginning to get together to discuss their stories about having grown up in the margins of society, not being able to talk to their teachers about their parents having been disappeared, and wanting to just try to get some justice, to seek more information, the truth about what had happened to their parents. They're children of my generation, so I was drawn to them, and I accompanied them. They let me interview them. So this was originally going to be a documentary, and in fact, I do have footage of the project. But then I moved to New York. I moved to New York with my future husband, and the documentary remained unfinished, which just made me sad. But the story stayed in my head. And then one day I just woke up with this idea of a young woman who would turn out to be Paloma, returning to Argentina. And anyway, it became a work of fiction, which it took me years to write, but I finally got it out, and I'm very happy, because I think these are stories that I felt were not known outside of Argentina. And I wanted others to know what had happened not that long ago. It was in the 1970s.
Yeah, it's an important story, and I'm glad you did. And sometimes, kind of like Elena finding her path, it just takes a while to find the right platform for your story, for what's in your head.
Well, so interestingly, Elena, so my father was a writer, but I didn't grow up thinking I wanted to be a writer. I was drawn to theater. I acted in plays, but I was terrible. I was not a good actress. So, that's so great what you were saying, that I guess I had those characters out in my head, I could develop them and then write them out on the page. So it was a way of also inhabiting other characters, So I appreciated hearing that, because that's, I think, what happened to me,
Well, and Lydia, you admit in your author's note about being a lot like Ruby. Is that something you did on purpose? And then also, do you find it maybe difficult to separate yourself from the characters?
I generally, I think a lot of authors put a little bit of themselves in there and some of their characters, not necessarily all of their characters, but much of what we fictionalize is still true emotion, or true experiences that we sort of kind of mold and shape and stick it in our book somehow. So I think there are a lot of things about Ruby that I enjoyed. She's a very curious person who has an interest in botanicals and science and poisons, things like that. And if you look at her, I think that if everybody sort of has this bias, if you see this beautifully well-dressed, extremely wealthy woman with the perfect hair and the jewelry and the gloves on and everything, and you don't realize that they have a college degree, and this is the 1940s, you might not think that they are anything more than arm candy, depending on who you are and what kind of perspective you might have. And so I really do like the idea that beyond what you see on the surface, there is so much depth, and oftentimes those biases and those judgments end up causing a lot of problems as far as, what you're trying to achieve, if you're a different character in the book, that sort of thing. So I really enjoyed. I think that it's very easy to be misjudged on. I think we probably all four of us have been misjudged in various times of our life based on how we looked, for whatever reason, based on our gender, our age, whatever. So that was something that I really did enjoy exploring with her.
Well, I want to move on from character here and talk more maybe content. One thing I'm interested in is Lydia, with yours about Oppenheimer and the quote you put at the beginning of your book. And I'll just read it here. Oppenheimer says, "There are no secrets about the world of nature. There are secrets about the thoughts and intentions of men." And of course, this comes to the forefront of our minds right now because Oppenheimer was one of the creators of the atomic bomb, and now we see ourselves in a world kind of at threat and on edge. So talk about what is valuable about sharing this story the way you have, and how that relates to what we're all witnessing right now.
One theme that I think a lot of my books have is usually something in the realm of science. Sometimes it's medicine, sometimes it's pathology. In this case, it's atomic physics. And with that comes that natural curiosity that all people have, and this incredibly ambitious drive to understand the inner workings of how this world works, down to the subatomic level. And it's a very pure drive, but at the same time, linked to that are all the human drives around it, which are not so pure, right? Money and power and politics and who's in charge of what gigantic piece of the world, which sort of was what was going on during World War II. And so I thought it was really interesting. There's definitely a parallel between that and these three characters trying to make their way through the world and trying to figure out, how do I fit into this world? How am I going to make this life worth living for me? And that's a very pure emotion, but at the same time, again, there are all these other factors that can sometimes be a little nefarious when they're trying to help you decide what you're going to do. And so, I really enjoyed exploring both that sort of pure nature of trying to figure out what's going on and how do we run this race, and ultimately the results of it, which are catastrophic and horrific on so many levels. We are still very much afraid of an atom bomb going off now in 2022. It is astounding, so it was unexpectedly timely, I guess, to know that I was going to write this book and that we would actually have those worries now. But it was also at the same time, it's an old story about humans trying to make their way through the world to try to understand the world we live in.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, and it's very interesting. Human curiosity, what it can do for us, both in the positive and in the negative sense. Elena, I want to ask you about Russian society. So as Americans, we have kind of a skewed view of Russia and its society, having been born there and grown up there, and you share that society from the perspective of a Russian, from a Soviet person. Tell us about both that perspective in your novel and kind of how you can eliminate our misperception through what we're reading in your book.
Well, the novel is set after World War II. It's post-World War II, when Stalin was still alive. That was the time of Stalin's purges and the time of fear. The fear was of being arrested and being an enemy of the people. That's what they called, anyone who Stalin wanted to arrest. And unfortunately, every family knew someone who was arrested and who disappeared into the camps, into the Gulag, or was executed. And my family was no exception. My mother's uncle was arrested in 1937 for telling a joke. And it wasn't even a political joke. It was an innocuous joke, but someone heard it, reported him. He was arrested. He disappeared into the camp. He never returned. And at that time, I was not growing up at the time of Stalin, of those purges. I was growing up later in the 1960s and 1970s when Anna Akhmatova, the Russian poet, called it she said, these are vegetarian times. Stalin's times were carnivorous times. That's when, millions of people, of Russians, were arrested and disappeared into the camps and were executed. And the vegetarian times, when I was growing up, there were no arrests in the middle of the night, but there was fear. The fear remained. The fear of of repressions, of not having any freedoms, of all the sources of independent information blocked, of having one narrative that the government produced, and there were two entirely different parallel realities. We lived with this monumental government lie that we were told every day. We were fed this lie, from the radio and from the television. And those were the only sources available to us because we literally lived behind the Iron Curtain. And one part of that lie, on the one hand, we had the best 5-year plans, the best harvest of this, that, and the other. And we were the best country in the world, and everyone wanted to be like us. And, the capitalist West was rotting. That's the word they were using. It was rotting, it was decaying, and it was on its way out. So we would have a communist world, very shortly. On the other hand, the second reality, the real reality, was that the store shelves were empty, that all the harvests went nowhere. At least we didn't see them. That stores were filled. What we had in the stores was, mass production. You couldn't say, okay, you couldn't buy a pair of shoes. You could buy a pair of shoes, but it was a pair of gray shoes that mangled your feet, and it looked the same. It was like one pair in different sizes. Everything was gray. Everything was the same. Everything was dreary. And that was the real reality. And I am very sorry and sad and heartbroken to say that this is the Russia today. This is what has happened since February 21st, when the war started. It went, the Iron Curtain has descended completely. All the independent news sources are blocked. There is no Facebook in Russia. There's no Instagram. There's no Twitter. There's no YouTube. So the only thing that people can get and do get is this narrative that blasts from television screens that it's not a war. You're not allowed to call it a war. It's a special military operation to save Ukraine. They're saving Ukraine. So what people hear is not that Kyiv is being bombed and the cities are bombed and maternity hospitals are bombed and people are killed. What they hear is, oh, Russia is providing humanitarian aid to Kyiv. Russia is helping Ukraine to rebuild. And it is Ukrainian Nazis, this is the word they're using, Nazis who are trying to kill Russians in Ukraine. And this is Orwellian. It's war is peace, slavery, what is it? Freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. That's what's happening in Russia right now. And not only that, anyone who calls it a war is arrested and can be imprisoned for up to 15 years. Those people who went to war protests, all of them have been arrested. I have to think that all of them, because more than 15,000 people have been arrested so far. And they're awaiting trials, and they will be imprisoned for up to 15 years. It is a totalitarian society. We're back to Stalin, not just to Brezhnev, not even to the 1970s when I was growing up, not to the vegetarian times. We're back to carnivorous times. We're back to Stalin's purges, because people are beginning, my friends tell me that, people are beginning to denounce people who support the regime, are beginning to denounce those who don't. And this is what is so frightening to me and to anyone who has lived through all this. I have friends and family in Ukraine who are sitting in bomb shelters in Kiev. I have family and friends in Russia, in different places, who have been taken hostage to this imperial paranoia of Putin. It's one man who unleashed this war and who has changed the lives of tens of millions practically overnight. And I'm heartbroken. I don't know what to do. Nobody knows what to do.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate, but I want to thank you so much for sharing all that with us. I mean, we could go on for hours about that, but it's just important to get as much information out there as possible, and even something like you're doing with your novel to show us that history does repeat itself, and we have to continually give reminders and teach each other and our children about what happens. And I think all of us were shocked that in 2022 that something like this was still possible. But if you look back at history, you'll see it's pretty much an endless cycle. Well, Andrea, let's move on to yours. Now, yours is a similarly tragic topic. Tell us a little bit more about what the Dirty War was. And what was interesting to me is I teach social studies in a high school, and we don't cover Argentina's Dirty War or the disappeared. Why do you think that is, and do you think it needs to change?
So I'm not surprised that it's not being taught in high schools. I have two boys who they're in school here in New York, and they haven't seen Latin American history, maybe in the very basic terms. And I think hopefully in college, if they can, they'll take some classes. It would be nice if high school students learned more about our neighboring continent to the south. It would be great. I think there's opportunity for that, and hopefully it'll happen. I'm not an educator, but meanwhile, people can read fiction, historical fiction, and that's an entry point. And then if they're curious, they'll go on and they can read history books or just do their own research. And that's one of the beauties about historical fiction. The Dirty War in my research, because I'll say something else, Colin, even in Argentina, the Dirty War wasn't really being taught up until not that long ago. When I was there in the 1990s, the history books would stop in 1976 with the beginning of the dictatorship, and then start up again in 1983. So it happened there too. It's a way of trying to erase the past. Now students can study it. The Dirty War began when Perón returned from exile. He was the former president of Argentina, and he had a fractured party, and he sided with the right wing of his party, and he wanted to get rid of the leftists, who he considered communists, Marxists. And so he quietly approved the disappearance of individuals who he deemed dangerous. And then when the coup happened, he died. I don't want to get to bog people down in the details, but then when the military government came in 1976, they just continued that systematic disappearance of people who they were afraid that they were going to take over the country and turn it into communist or a socialist country. So that's what the Dirty War was. And in fact, it was just a way of for the government to get rid of people that they were afraid of: intellectuals, artists, journalists, thinkers. And it lasted really from 1973 until 1983. So it was like 10 years. And the dirty war, that term was used by the military to try to bring across that it was a war when it really wasn't a war. There were very few urban guerrillas in the country, and they had been wiped out by the time the coup happened. So it's, dirty war. It wasn't really a war.
Yeah, it is interesting to me that it's not covered more, and not just the dirty war, but the history of Latin America. As I said, it's not in our curriculum where I teach, and I didn't really know much about the history of Latin America until I took a class in graduate school. So, and I had to specifically choose history of Latin America. Well, we've got about 15 minutes here. We do have a couple questions from the audience. I see Sierra asks, hi, I'm wondering if you can talk about the craft of integrating research seamlessly into scenes without relying too heavily on exposition. So Sierra must be a writer. In fact, I know she is. So Lydia, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh man, it's really hard to do, and I think I think that we are all extremely enthusiastic about what we know and wanting to put it on the page. I think anybody who writes historical fiction, there's this like little niggling sort of thing inside you that's sort of like, I have to put more down just to prove to everybody that I actually know what I'm talking about. Like I actually did the research and I know it. You have to really refrain from just dumping all the information on the page, and you have to wield it just like you would when you're sort of painting a picture. As you just don't dump all depending on the kind of painting that you're making, but you have to be careful about not just like putting it all down first. You want to just tell the story, and the history is going to weave itself into the scenes in these tiny little ways, and the clothes that they're wearing, and what they're seeing, what they're smelling when they're on the street. In my book, you can't get away from the fact that there are kids, gathering tinfoil on the side because there's a scrap metal drive. You can't get away from the fact that there are Bond posters on every other window on the street. So it infuses itself into the scenes sort of naturally, and you kind of know when you're going too far when you just get a little overly descriptive in clothing or something like that. You have to sometimes let scenery be scenery, and I think just getting a little distance, coming back to it, and reading it so that it feels a little bit more objective, and then you can start to weed out some of the extraneous details that just don't need to be there, that just sort of bog the story down.
Yeah, and it definitely takes some practice and feedback. So if you are a writer, do your research, do the writing, and then, kind of get the feedback and mold it from there, I think. And Elena, you have an interesting perspective because you mentioned you wrote memoir before this. Did you find yourself weaving some of the personal experience in memoir, and how did you change it from memoir to fiction?
Well, it was an interesting change. I finally, I have two memoirs that I wrote, and I finally decided that I've exposed myself enough. I've exposed everything, so I have to make things up now. But interestingly, and I wanted to write this novel based on the story of my sister. I wanted to examine the process of acting, and I was also fascinated by that time, the time of right after the war, during the war, and it has some scenes during the war that every family in Russia lost someone in the war, and in my family it was my two uncles who died at the front. I never called them uncles because I never, they died before I was born, but they were my mother's two brothers. So it's sort of that the war, that World War II, is sort of baked into Russian blood, I think, and it is this glue that united people after the war, despite that terrible fear and Stalin's repressions and Stalin's purges. So I wanted to write a novel about that. And when I wrote when I presented a draft to my agent, it wasn't the first draft. Of course, it was like 27th draft for me, but for her, it was the first draft that she saw. So she read it and she said, "That's not a novel, it's a memoir." It's a memoir. She said, "You are doing another memoir." And I didn't want to do another memoir. So I took it back and I plotted, I changed the plot, I changed, things that happened. I added the twists and scenes and changed the characters. And then, it became more of a novel, and I hope I learned how to write a novel better. I know I don't know how to write a good novel, maybe, or an excellent novel, but I know better now how to write it and what to do. But as the writer James Coetzee, who wrote Disgrace, and he's a Nobel Prize winner in literature, he has this famous quote that says, "All writing is autobiography." And I think it's very true. We base things, even when we write novels, even when it's fiction, even when it's historical fiction, and we set it at other times, we base it on what we know, on the people we know, on the happenings that we have experienced or someone we know has experienced. And I think it very much comes from our gut, from the inside of what we are as people, as writers.
Yeah, definitely. We can't take ourselves out completely. Andrea, do you have anything to add? I know you said this started as a documentary. You must have had a lot of information to go off of.
I did have a lot of information, and I would put that all on the page and then trim it back, trim it down, and try to sprinkle it throughout the novel so the reader wouldn't become too bogged down with the details and trying, not losing themselves in all the research I had done. But it was very important for me to have that. And so in the earlier drafts, yes, there was much more. And yeah, that's all. I think, with the second novel I'm researching, the same thing is happening again, that I have a lot. But at one point you have to stop doing the research and start writing. So that's something I'm dealing with right now.
Yeah, you could definitely get carried away, I think, especially, if it's something you're personally passionate and interested in. And Lydia made a good point that sometimes I have a problem of doing too much research. But I think that leads into this next question we have from Dalma. And before I ask it, I'm going to use this to plug our next panel. So Dalma is an author of historical fiction, and she's going to be appearing on our next panel, which will be April 28th. So if you want to follow History Through Fiction on Crowdcast, there'll be information about that forthcoming. But she says, I read historical fiction to get beyond the headlines and find the human heart of the story. What is the heart of your book, and how does time and place influence the story? So Lydia, what do you think?
That's a good question, and I'm glad I actually read that question before, because I had to really think about it. It's a tough one. I think ultimately, and I apologize if this is a cliche, but that the heart of the story is people trying to find meaning in their lives, right? And the time and place in World War II, the war really ends up becoming a tool by which these three characters try to find their purpose. For Will, it's being somebody who's in control and makes the decisions, as opposed to being one of the little men who's just always following orders and having to do someone else's bidding. He has come from a family of people who always have a boss. And he's like, I would like to be the person who makes the decisions. And the war is a way by which he could try to get a leg up that way. And Maggie is trying to find self-sufficiency and agency, and working at the Navy Yard as a way of doing that. And with Ruby, we don't know exactly what she wants, but she's certainly playing every card that she has with respect to the different people that she is encountering in the book. But she's doing the same thing. She is escaping from a violent past and trying to forge another one. And the war is another means by which she can insinuate herself and get where she needs to get.
So, Elena, how about you? What is the heart of your story?
Well, it's the protagonist is an actress, and acting, as a layman would say, is pretending. It's pretending to be someone else. And real life is real life, and it's supposed to be a true life. And in post World War II Russia, at the time of those two entirely different parallel realities, the truth was in the art. The art was what was the source of truth, and everyday life turned out to be the source of lies, this monumental government lie. So it is this juxtaposition, this conflict between the truth of art and the official curtain of lies. And because of that, I just wanted to show that this was the case, that art is always trying to find the truth, to get to the truth. And real acting, as any real art, has to be truthful. Actors really believe in what they do. They believe in the suggested circumstances of the scene, of the play, of the character. And that life, the real Russian life, Soviet life, was nothing but lies. And it was important for me to understand. I understood it myself, and I wanted the novel to show this, that for that generation, the arts offered the only road to freedom in Russia.
I love that you say, the truth is an art, and that's something I struggled with fiction, because the truth comes out in emotional truths, and as a historian, I was like, well, doesn't it come from the facts? And you could just kind of show it how it's the other way around in many cases. Andrea, so what is the heart of your story?
So my protagonist, Paloma, she is going to go on this journey of discovery. And in doing so, she's going to lose her innocence, but she's going to gain a deeper understanding of herself, her family's country, and that there's hope and power to be gained by dispelling the lies and the ignorance that has afflicted a society.
Yeah, hope. It's always an important heart of a story. Well, we're just coming to the end here. Before we wrap things up, I do want to remind our audience that you can find these books through these authors' publishers, their websites. You can click on the Get Your Book Now, and that'll take you to a landing page where you can find a place to pre-order their books. I want to thank the panelists. This has been really insightful, and I wish we could keep talking here for a while. There's so much to get to. We were just able to scratch the surface, I think. Before we do conclude, I do have one more question that I'd like all of you to answer. One thing that really interests me about all of you is that you are so much more than fiction writers. You all came from very accomplished positions in life, and yet after already writing nonfiction and other forms, you came to historical fiction. So what is it about historical fiction that made you decide at this point to share your stories that way, and what is the value that historical fiction has for readers? Lydia, could you get us started on that?
Sure. I mean, I think that what history through fiction is really what it's about, right? When I was in high school and college, I didn't really enjoy my history classes. Maybe just I didn't have good chemistry with my teachers. I don't know. And it wasn't until I was a little bit older and I really started to appreciate the history of New York City, which is where I did college, medical school, residency, all that stuff. I was at Bellevue Hospital, which is just this really famous historical hospital. And I knew at some point in time that if I ever wrote a book, I would have to put Bellevue in there, but Bellevue from way back when. Bellevue that we hear about from the 1800s or the early 1900s. So I don't know, I've learned more through the writing of these books as well as through reading of other historical fiction than I ever did in school. And I think it is because of the truth that comes from these human stories that are fictional or non-fictional that really bring everything alive, as opposed to, maybe what I had to do in school, memorize the dates and this happened and that happened. And it was just dry as sawdust. This is a completely different world. And I am really looking forward to writing more of it.
Great. Yeah, it definitely brings it to life. So, Elena, what do you think? Why did you end up writing historical fiction, and what is the value in it, do you think?
Well, the value is invaluable, if I can say that. I don't know if I can, because English is not my first language. But unfortunately, we see that history repeats itself. And it's so evident now in what's happening in Russia. We're back to the totalitarian regime of this novel, unfortunately, of Stalin's times. And maybe if Putin had learned history instead of, learning the KGB manuals when he was a KGB officer, maybe he wouldn't have done what he did. It's this ignorance, historical ignorance that, some people have. He's not a very knowledgeable person. And I'm not saying that we should write historical novels for someone like him. No, we shouldn't. We should forget. He should be erased from the face of the earth in one way or another. But I think it's really important to examine history, to examine life and people's identities and countries' identities at different times in history, so that we understand what some people are going through now, because nothing has changed. We know that humans are humans, and people do the same things they did 2,000 years ago. There is progress, of course, technological and medical and otherwise, but as far as people's souls, we need to know what people did under certain historical circumstances, and we don't want certain historical periods to be repeated.
Yeah, unfortunately, as you said, that historical ignorance is still prevalent, and what you're doing helps eliminate that, hopefully. And I think Dalma made a good point about the nuances. Fiction helps us get to the nuances of history and makes it more rounded for all of us. Were you going to add something, Elena?
No, I was just agreeing with what you were saying.
Okay. And Andrea, you've got the last word then.
Okay, yes. I was one of the people who is watching said, yeah, the nuances. I think that when I'm reading historical fiction, I connect in a way with the characters in a way that I won't if I'm reading a history book. So I think the stories, what it would feel like to live during that time period, writers of historical fiction, I think, could do that so well. I mean, it transports you to a time and a place in a way that nonfiction can't. So that's why I love historical fiction.
And so do I, and that's why I created History Through Fiction. Well, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun, and we made it through without any technical difficulties, as far as I can tell. A few dog barks, but that was it. So thanks, everyone, for joining us today, and I hope you have a good rest of the evening.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.